It was supposed to be the perfect start, a fresh chapter in a new house, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the biggest excitement was the weekly lawn mowing competition. The protagonist, eager for a change of scenery, had recently moved into a charming cottage-style home. The kind of place you could picture yourself sipping morning coffee on the porch, watching kids run by, and living the dream. But that dream began to fray around the edges the moment the power bills came in. It started innocuously enough. The first bill was a little higher than expected. Nothing too alarming, just a few extra dollars from running the AC during the summer. But when the second bill arrived, it was nearly double. That wasn't right. The house was small. The appliances weren't running any more than usual. And yet, there it was, a spike. The protagonist chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe there was an error in the meter reading. But as the days passed, the bills kept rising. What was once a gentle concern turned into a gnawing suspicion. Something was wrong. The neighbor next door, Karen, was the HOA president, and everyone knew she had a particular fondness for order. She wasn't the type to shy away from calling out anyone for even the tiniest infraction. Whether it was a misplaced trash can or an untrimmed hedge, Karen had a tendency to remind you of the rules, always with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her power was subtle but inescapable, the kind that could make you feel small, as if you were always in her gaze, under her control. And now, with the rising bills, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder, could she be involved? It wasn't long before they started noticing strange things. At night, the power in the house would flicker at odd intervals. The lights dimmed when the protagonist turned on appliances, like the fridge or the microwave. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but there, lingering at the back of their mind, a feeling that something wasn't right. And then, the real clue, Karen's house. Every time the lights flickered, it seemed to happen when Karen's house was brightly lit, long after dark. A neighborly curiosity began to creep in, but no amount of rational thinking could explain it. The final straw came on a stormy evening. The protagonist returned home from work to find the house in darkness. The storm had passed hours ago, and yet there was no power. After a quick glance at the electrical meter, a chill ran down their spine. The needle on the meter was spinning at a dizzying speed, faster than any amount of appliances could explain. It was as if something, or someone, was siphoning power from their line. Suddenly, everything clicked. Karen's obsession with order, her relentless monitoring of everyone in the neighborhood, the flickering lights at just the right time. And now this. The protagonist stood frozen, staring at the meter. That was it, the undeniable evidence that something had been wrong all along. This wasn't a simple mistake or faulty wiring. Karen had been taking their power. But why? What could she possibly gain by stealing someone else's electricity? The thought alone made the protagonist's blood run cold. As the storm raged outside, the protagonist clenched their fists, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a violation. They'd been targeted, and now there was only one thing left to do: figure out how to prove it. The night had only just begun, and already the stakes were rising. But Karen had no idea that her petty theft was about to spark something much bigger and much more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The next few days were a blur of quiet observation and creeping paranoia. The protagonist couldn't stop thinking about the power meter. It was the first thing they checked every morning and the last thing they checked every night. Something had to be off. It was the only explanation for the strange fluctuations in power. But no matter how many times they looked at it, the needle never stopped spinning, and the bills kept climbing higher. Karen, meanwhile, acted as if nothing was wrong. She greeted the protagonist with her usual practiced smile as she watered her garden or adjusted her maillocks, always with a casual wave as if everything was perfectly normal. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, always lingered just a second too long. It was as if she knew something the protagonist didn't, a secret that hummed in the air like an unspoken challenge. The protagonist's gut twisted with suspicion, but they had no concrete proof. They needed something undeniable. It wasn't just the power surge anymore, it was the principle of it. Karen was stealing their electricity, and if the protagonist didn't stop her now, who knew what else she would take next? That night, after Karen's house flickered on like clockwork, the protagonist decided to act. They had already noticed the subtle pattern. Every time they used their own power, Karen's house seemed to come alive in sync with theirs. The lights dimmed when they turned on the microwave. The TV flickered when they flipped the bathroom light on. It was subtle but calculated, a well-timed drain of power from the protagonist's meter. But there was one thing the protagonist hadn't noticed until now. Karen always made sure to leave just enough distance between the flickers. She was clever, almost too clever. If the protagonist were paying attention at the wrong time, it would just seem like a minor glitch. Karen had perfected the art of stealing electricity without anyone noticing, making the theft almost impossible to trace. The protagonist knew they needed to catch her in the act. But how? They could confront her, but there was no real evidence. Karen would deny everything, and they'd be left looking like paranoid neighbors. No, the protagonist needed something undeniable, something that would leave Karen no room to lie. That's when the idea hit. They would set up cameras, hidden ones, simple enough to install, and the footage would catch every movement, every flicker, every sign of Karen's scheming. The next day, the protagonist spent hours setting up surveillance around the house. Hidden cameras were discreetly placed, covering the front and back entrances and the area around the electrical meter. They even set up a motion sensor that would trigger a recording every time someone approached the meter. It was a risky move. If Karen figured out what they were doing, it could backfire. But the protagonist knew they were running out of options. That night, as the sun sank below the horizon, they sat quietly in their living room, pretending to watch TV, but all their attention was on the cameras. The minutes ticked by. Tension thickened in the air. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest as the clock reached the time when Karen usually came out to check on things. Then, a flicker. The lights in the protagonist's house dimmed, just as they had before. A surge. And there, in the reflection of the window, a shadow moved. The figure of Karen, creeping toward the meter box. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. This was it. They were finally about to see it, see her in the act. Their fingers hovered over the remote, ready to hit record on the camera feed. The screen flickered again. A flicker that wasn't just the lights. Karen had done it. She was tampering with the meter. For a moment, the protagonist was frozen. They had proof. Real, irrefutable proof. But just as quickly as it had happened, Karen disappeared into the shadows, slipping away into the night like a ghost. The protagonist's mind raced, every muscle tense. This wasn't just theft anymore. It was something far more sinister. They had caught her, but what was she really up to? What had she been planning all along? The feeling of triumph quickly turned to unease. Now that the protagonist knew the truth, what would they do next? The answer was clear: confront Karen. But one question lingered. How far would she go to cover her tracks? The next morning, the protagonist could barely focus on anything else. They'd seen it with their own eyes. Karen had been sneaking onto their property, tampering with the power meter. The footage was irrefutable, the proof undeniable. Yet, despite the adrenaline pumping through their veins, the protagonist knew they couldn't confront Karen just yet. Not without more evidence. The stakes were too high. One wrong move, one slip-up, and Karen could spin the whole thing into a web of lies, making the protagonist look like the aggressor. No, they needed more, something airtight, something that would leave Karen nowhere to hide. That afternoon, the protagonist sat in front of the computer, reviewing the footage. They replayed the moment over and over. Karen's shadow creeping toward the meter box, the brief flicker of the lights, the way she casually fiddled with the wires as if she had done it 100 times before. It was a chilling sight, but it wasn't enough. The footage alone wouldn't be enough to convince anyone else. The HOA would need more. The authorities would need more. The protagonist had to dig deeper. They spent the next several days monitoring Karen's every move. They tracked her schedule, noting the times when she came and went. The more they observed, the more the pattern began to emerge. Karen wasn't just stealing electricity out of convenience. No, it was a calculated effort. She seemed to be doing it at regular intervals, always when the energy usage in the neighborhood spiked. But why? What was the reason behind it? The protagonist's suspicions began to grow. Was Karen simply a petty thief, or was there something bigger at play? Perhaps she had been using the stolen power to manipulate her own situation, to gain leverage over her neighbors, or worse, was there a larger scheme, some deeper plan they hadn't uncovered yet? The more the protagonist thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. Karen's overbearing presence in the neighborhood, her constant surveillance of others, her obsessive need to maintain control over every aspect of the HOA. It all pointed to one thing. She was addicted to power. Literal power. And now she had been siphoning it from the protagonist, using it for her own benefit without a care in the world for the damage she was causing. It was infuriating, but there was no time to waste on speculation. The protagonist needed concrete proof, something that would leave Karen nowhere to hide. Late one night, after everyone else in the neighborhood had gone to bed, the protagonist put their plan into motion. They had already installed hidden cameras, but now they needed something more invasive. They installed a smart energy meter, one that could track minute-by-minute fluctuations in power usage. It would give them a precise record of when the power was being stolen, how much was being taken, and for how long. The protagonist worked quickly, setting up the system in place of the old meter, making sure it would be nearly impossible to detect. With the camera feed running in the background, they could monitor every movement. The meter would act as their lifeline, proof of what had been happening all along. The days that followed were a blur of surveillance, patience, and growing anticipation. The protagonist couldn't afford to slip up now. They knew Karen would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, any hint that someone was onto her. But the protagonist's resolve only hardened. They had to keep their cool. Every night, they reviewed the footage, every flicker, every surge of energy. They watched as Karen came and went, always with the same methodical pattern, approaching the meter box under the cover of darkness, her movements quick and practiced. But each time, they caught a glimpse of something new. The power fluctuations were getting worse. The readings were off the charts. Something was changing. The more the protagonist watched, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just stealing power anymore. She was manipulating the system itself. And with each passing day, it became more obvious that this was about to explode in a way the protagonist couldn't have predicted. Karen was no longer just a petty thief. She had become a threat, a dangerous force that wouldn't stop until everything in her way had been destroyed. The storm was gathering, and the protagonist knew they were standing at the eye of it. What was Karen planning? Why had she pushed things so far? And how long would it take before the whole neighborhood found out what she had been doing in the dark? The questions lingered, unanswered, but the protagonist knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about stolen electricity. It was about survival. And they weren't about to let Karen win. The days dragged on like an endless game of cat and mouse. The protagonist had gathered more than enough evidence, but something felt off. They'd seen the patterns, analyzed the data, and reviewed the footage until their eyes ached. It was all there: Karen's theft of electricity, her well-timed visits to the power meter, her sly, untraceable movements. Yet even with all this, the question still burned in the back of the protagonist's mind. Why? Why had Karen gone so far? Why not just steal a little power here and there, as most thieves did? No, Karen wasn't acting like someone desperate for a quick fix. She was meticulous, patient, almost too clever. The protagonist couldn't shake the sense that Karen had a bigger game in mind, a much larger, more dangerous plot. But what? That night, as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the protagonist sat by their desk, reviewing the footage yet again. The wind outside began to howl, battering against the windows as rain began to pour down in torrents. The tension in the house was palpable. Every creak of the old walls, every rumble of thunder seemed to echo through the silence. The protagonist was on edge, watching the flickering lights of the computer screen, waiting for the next clue, the next telltale sign that Karen was making her move. And then it happened. The power went out. All at once, every light in the house shut off. The television screen blinked to black. The hum of the fridge stopped. The silence was deafening, and the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a simple power outage. This was something different, deliberate. The storm hadn't been bad enough to knock out power, not like this. The neighborhood was completely dark, but the storm wasn't the cause. No, someone had made sure the power was cut. The protagonist bolted from their seat, rushing to the meter box outside. The wind howled louder, as if mocking them, as they flipped open the small metal door. It didn't take long to see it. The meter was gone, vanished, just a gaping hole where it used to be, empty and cold. The wires had been severed cleanly, as if someone had been prepared for this moment. Panic surged through the protagonist's veins. What the hell was going on? But just as the storm outside intensified, a chilling realization hit them. This wasn't just about power anymore. Karen had taken it a step further. She hadn't just been siphoning electricity. She had cut it off entirely. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd stolen enough to drain the system, to ruin the house's power supply for good. The protagonist's mind raced. Had she been planning this all along? Did she know the new smart meter had been installed? Was this a step in a bigger, more calculated move to destroy everything they had worked for? The more they thought about it, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just playing a petty game anymore. This was sabotage. They stood there in the cold, dark silence of the night, hands trembling as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. The storm raged around them, yet it felt as if the world had paused. For a moment, nothing seemed real. Everything had shifted, and the protagonist realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that they were in much deeper than they'd ever expected. Karen had just escalated the game, and now it was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival. The protagonist's chest tightened as they realized that the fight had just begun. The power outage wasn't just a result of theft. It was a warning. Karen had gone too far. And now, there was no going back. The protagonist needed to act fast, before Karen's game spiraled out of control. But where would it end? Would the authorities even believe them now? What was Karen's next move? And how far would she push this madness before someone got hurt? One thing was certain, this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The protagonist's hands shook as they stood in the cold, darkened yard, staring at the severed meter box. The storm had intensified, the wind howling as if the heavens themselves were conspiring with Karen. The power had been cut, the meter stolen, and now they were left with nothing but the eerie silence of the night. But amidst the chaos, a nagging thought began to creep into the protagonist's mind, cutting through the tension like a cold knife. What if this was just part of something bigger? The storm's fury seemed almost like a reflection of their inner turmoil. If Karen had stolen power, it was bad enough. But to tamper with the house's entire energy system, to leave them powerless on purpose, it felt like more than just petty theft. It felt like sabotage. But why? What had Karen hoped to achieve? The protagonist's mind spun as they retraced every step of the last few days. Karen's strange behavior, the subtle flickers of light, the surges of energy, and now this, the deliberate destruction of their power source. It wasn't just about the theft. Karen had been playing a much deeper game, a game with consequences that extended far beyond a single home. The protagonist paced through the house, their thoughts racing. They needed to think clearly, to plan their next move. Karen had been bold, too bold, and now it was clear. She was testing their limits. She wanted control, complete control. The question was, why? And then it hit them. The HOA. The power, the surveillance, the way Karen had kept a stranglehold on the neighborhood's every move. It wasn't just about electricity or power. Karen had used her position as HOA president to manipulate every detail of the neighborhood's life. She had built an empire, with invisible strings pulling everyone around her. The protagonist had unknowingly walked into her web, and now they were tangled in it. But there was more. The neighborhood had always been tight-knit, almost too perfect. Everyone followed the rules, kept their lawns pristine, and lived under the heavy shadow of Karen's guidance. What if Karen had been using the stolen power to fuel some grander scheme? Perhaps the manipulation went beyond the physical. What if she had been using the stolen energy to spy on the neighborhood, to control them? Perhaps she had planted cameras or hidden devices all over, feeding off the power from unsuspecting houses. The realization sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. Karen wasn't just a thief. She was a puppet master, weaving a web of influence and control. The electricity wasn't just for her convenience. It was for something far more insidious. But how far did it go? Determined to uncover the truth, the protagonist decided to take the fight directly to Karen. The power might have been cut, but their resolve had never been stronger. They had the footage, the surveillance, and the knowledge of Karen's patterns. It was time to confront her, head-on. That evening, after the storm subsided, the protagonist gathered everything they needed. The footage, the smart meter data, and the hidden camera feeds. Everything that proved Karen's involvement. But as they prepared to knock on Karen's door, a thought stopped them cold. What if confronting her would be the last thing they should do? What if, in doing so, they would walk straight into a trap? They took a deep breath, steeling themselves for whatever was to come. This was bigger than just a simple neighborhood dispute. The protagonist wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their freedom. As the doorbell rang, the sound echoed through the empty house like a drumbeat of fate. Karen had played her hand, but now it was the protagonist's turn. The silence stretched between them as the door creaked open. "Can I help you?" Karen's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with something the protagonist couldn't quite place. A hint of triumph. The storm had passed, but now the true storm was about to begin. And this time, the protagonist was ready. The door creaked open slowly, the faint hum of the wind still lingering in the air, as if the storm had left its fingerprints on the very atmosphere. Karen stood there, as poised and unnervingly calm as ever, her smile widening ever so slightly as the protagonist stepped forward. The familiar, carefully curated image of the perfect neighbor was intact, but the tension crackling in the air between them was anything but normal. The protagonist swallowed hard, the weight of the moment bearing down. Every instinct screamed to turn around and leave, to walk away and let the authorities handle this. But they had come this far, too far to back down now. "I know what you've been doing," the protagonist said, their voice steady, but with an edge that cut through the tension like a knife. Karen's eyes flickered, just for a second, but that was all it took. It was a brief, almost imperceptible shift, one that sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. Karen hadn't expected the confrontation, not yet. She'd been playing a game of chess, and it seemed she hadn't fully accounted for this move. "I'm sorry, I don't quite follow," Karen said, her voice dripping with sweetness, though the underlying tension in her tone betrayed her. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" The protagonist held up their phone, a screenshot of the footage they'd captured just days before. Karen, caught red-handed, tampering with the power meter in the dead of night. The lights in the house flickering as she worked, the way she moved with cold precision, as if it was just another routine task. Karen's gaze locked on the screen, her face not showing shock, but something else entirely. A quiet, almost amused recognition, as if she'd known this moment would come, yet was oddly unperturbed by it. "So, you've been watching me," Karen said softly, her voice almost a whisper now. "That's cute. How long did it take you to figure it out?" The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't the reaction they'd expected. Karen wasn't surprised. She wasn't even angry. She was calculating. "And you think this proves something?" Karen continued, her smile widening ever so slightly. "That I stole some power. Please, you have no idea what's really happening here." The protagonist's blood ran cold. What did she mean by that? Before they could respond, Karen stepped aside, her gesture inviting the protagonist into the house. But it wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. "Come inside. Let me show you something." Reluctantly, the protagonist stepped over the threshold, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The house, despite its outward appearance of calm, felt wrong. There was something heavy about the air. It was as if they were walking into the very eye of a storm, where everything seemed still, but danger lingered just beneath the surface. Karen led the protagonist through the dimly lit hallway, past photographs of a life that seemed picture-perfect. But there was something off about the whole scene. The walls felt too silent, the air too still. They stopped in front of a door at the back of the house, one that hadn't been visible from the front rooms. Karen turned, her smile still in place, though her eyes gleamed with something darker now. "This," she said, her voice low, "is where it all begins. Come on in." The protagonist's pulse quickened. What was behind that door? What had they just walked into? Karen pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with monitors. Dozens of them. Each screen was alive with feeds from various cameras, each angle capturing different parts of the neighborhood. The monitors flickered with a strange, rhythmic pattern, as though they were alive with the same pulse that had been surging through the power grid. "This," Karen said with a cold, calculated smile, "is where I've been keeping an eye on everything. Everyone." The protagonist's breath caught in their throat as they realized the full extent of the horror. Karen hadn't just been stealing power. She'd been building an empire, a network of surveillance and control, all running on the stolen electricity. "You didn't just steal from me," the protagonist whispered, the words heavy with disbelief. "You've been watching all of us." Karen's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous, unhinged satisfaction. "I told you, you have no idea what's really happening, and you never will, because now you're a part of it." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on the protagonist, as if the very house had become a trap. The protagonist realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. And in this game, they were playing by Karen's rules. The smile on Karen's face remained, but in her eyes, there was no mercy. The protagonist stood frozen in the dim room, the blinking monitors casting an eerie glow on their face. Each feed on the screen showed a different angle of the neighborhood. Their neighbors, their homes, their lives, reduced to nothing more than surveillance footage. It was a web of control, every inch carefully mapped out, every movement watched. Karen stood beside them, her gaze intense, unwavering, like a puppet master proud of her handiwork. "You think I'm just some petty thief? You think this is about electricity?" Her voice was low, almost mocking, yet there was a hint of something far darker beneath the surface, something that sent a chill through the protagonist's bones. "This is about control, power. Do you know how easy it is to manipulate people when you control their resources, their lives?" Karen's smile was chilling, almost predatory. "I didn't just steal power. I took it. I watched, I listened, and I understood everything about this neighborhood long before you ever suspected a thing." The protagonist's mind raced, their pulse hammering in their chest. This wasn't just about electricity. This was a conspiracy, a twisted game of dominance, and the protagonist had unknowingly stepped into the center of it. Karen wasn't just playing a petty game with them. She was manipulating the entire neighborhood, weaving a network of surveillance and control that stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined. "I've been monitoring everyone," Karen continued, her tone almost matter-of-fact. "The neighborhood, the HOA meetings, the local elections. Every move, every word, everything feeds into my system. They think they're in control. They think they know what's happening. But I've been pulling the strings the entire time." The protagonist felt a surge of nausea. "This is bigger than I thought." Karen had been using the stolen power to fuel a vast network, one that had been watching and listening to everything. From the moment the protagonist had moved in, they had been a part of Karen's game, just another piece on the chessboard, unknowingly making the moves she wanted them to make. "You see," Karen's voice was soft now, but the underlying threat was clear. It wasn't just about the meter. It was about you. You were getting too close to the truth. You were starting to ask the wrong questions, so I had to make sure you stayed quiet. That's why I've been messing with your power. That's why I've been so careful." Her smile returned, colder than before. "And now, you're in it too." The protagonist felt their heart drop. The walls were closing in. There was no escape, no way out. Karen wasn't just a thief. She was a mastermind, pulling the strings of everyone's lives without them even realizing it. The system she created was far too powerful, too intricate. She had eyes everywhere. And now, the protagonist had become part of her web. "But you don't have to be part of it, not if you don't want to," Karen said, her voice almost too sweet, too calm. "I've given you a choice. I can make things easy for you. You can walk away from this and pretend it never happened. Just pretend you never saw any of this." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Or you can try to expose me, and trust me, that will be the last mistake you ever make." The protagonist's stomach twisted, the weight of Karen's words sinking in. They were trapped. There was no way out, no escape, but there had to be something they could do. They couldn't let Karen win. Not like this. Not after everything she had done. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the air thick with unspoken threats. The protagonist's mind was a storm of thoughts, of plans, of retaliation, of the one thing they could do to fight back. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She leaned in close, her breath cold against the protagonist's ear. "You'll do what I say," she whispered, "or I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. Everyone will see the real you. And that won't be pretty." The protagonist's blood ran cold, but something deep inside them snapped. Karen had underestimated them. She thought she had them cornered. She thought she could control them. But the protagonist wasn't some helpless pawn. Not anymore. With a deep breath, they stepped back, facing Karen with newfound resolve. "You're wrong," they said, their voice steady, cutting through the tension. "This game isn't over, and I'm not going to be the one who loses." Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering just slightly. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very air was about to ignite. The protagonist's heart raced. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the fire of defiance. The storm was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. The protagonist wasn't going down without a fight. The silence that followed felt suffocating. For a moment, neither Karen nor the protagonist moved, the air thick with unspoken tension. The protagonist's pulse raced, every fiber of their being urging them to act, to strike, to expose Karen for the puppet master she was. But Karen's presence loomed, imposing and unnervingly calm, as if she were just waiting for the protagonist to make a move. And in that stillness, her smile returned, colder than before. "Are you really going to fight me?" Karen asked, her voice smooth, yet laced with a dangerous edge. "Do you think you can win?" The protagonist met her gaze without flinching, their mind racing through every possibility. This wasn't just about stealing power anymore, it was about survival. They had already come too far to back down now. The game Karen had been playing was far from over, but the protagonist had learned enough to understand one crucial truth. Karen's greatest weapon was her confidence. She believed she controlled everything, from the power in their homes to the very fabric of the neighborhood. But there was one thing Karen hadn't accounted for: the protagonist's ability to adapt, to see through the cracks in her web. "Karen," the protagonist began, their voice steady, unwavering, "you think you have everything under control. But you don't. Not anymore." Karen's eyes flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty passing through her expression before it was quickly masked by that cold smile. But the seed of doubt had been planted. "I know about your network," the protagonist continued, stepping forward. "I know about the surveillance, the manipulation, everything you've done to control this entire neighborhood. But I also know your weakness." Karen's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly do you think that is?" The protagonist took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of confidence they could muster. "You've been stealing power, right? But you've been relying on the electricity from the very homes you've been spying on. You don't have a backup plan. If the power goes out, your whole system crumbles." For a split second, Karen's composure faltered. It was subtle, but it was there. And that was enough. With a swift motion, the protagonist reached into their bag, pulling out a small device. It was an EMP jammer, something they had managed to get their hands on during the past few days of research. Karen's eyes widened, the realization dawning on her too late. "You think I didn't prepare for this?" Karen hissed, stepping back, but the protagonist was already one step ahead. The device whirred to life in their hand, sending a pulse of electromagnetic interference into the air. The lights in the room flickered, the monitors sputtered, and then, complete darkness. The world went silent, the hum of Karen's hidden empire dying in an instant. The screens that had once displayed the neighborhood in perfect, invasive clarity were now black. The once imposing house felt suddenly small and vulnerable, the walls closing in on the woman who had built her empire on surveillance and control. For the first time in what felt like forever, Karen was powerless. "You thought you could control everyone by watching them," the protagonist said, their voice calm but strong. "But you can't control what you can't see." Karen's face twisted into a snarl, her eyes wild with disbelief. "You don't understand. You'll never understand what I've built." The protagonist stepped forward, their hands steady as they pointed toward the door. "No, Karen, you don't understand. You never did. This is where your game ends." The protagonist turned away, leaving Karen to stew in the darkness of her own creation. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit their skin like a refreshing wave. The storm had passed, leaving only the quiet aftermath. For the first time in days, the protagonist could breathe freely, knowing they had won. Karen's empire had fallen, crumbling to dust in the wake of their defiance. The protagonist didn't look back as they walked away, their hearts still pounding, but now with a sense of triumph. The fight had been fierce, but in the end, it was a fight for freedom. For the first time in what felt like forever, the protagonist felt in control of their own destiny. And as they disappeared into the night, they knew one thing for certain: Karen's reign was over. The shadows that had once threatened to swallow everything had been pushed back, and now the protagonist stood in the light, victorious.